It's hard for me to tell this story, mainly because I don't fully understand what happened. But I feel like I need to, if only to get it off my chest. And maybe, just maybe, it'll help me make some sense of it. You see, it wasn't supposed to be anything unusual. Just a weekend trip, a couple of friends, a cabin in the woods. But what happened in those woods, I can't explain it, and I don't know if I ever will. It was early November, and the air had already taken on that biting chill, the kind that seeps into your bones. My friend Adam had suggested the trip. He'd found this old cabin a few hours outside the city, deep in the woods. It sounded like the perfect escape from work and everything else. I was excited. Adam, his girlfriend Claire, and my best friend Nate were all coming, so it was going to be a fun weekend. Just the four of us. We left on a Friday afternoon, cramming all our stuff into the back of Nate's SUV. The drive was pleasant enough. Quiet roads, autumn leaves still clinging to the trees, their colors muted by the gray skies. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how calm everything felt. In hindsight, maybe it was too calm. The cabin was, well, rustic. That's probably the best word for it. Old wooden walls, a stone fireplace, no electricity, and just enough space for the four of us. But it was cozy in a way, and we didn't mind. It felt like a nice change from the usual city noise. There was no cell reception, which honestly felt like a blessing at the time. Just a couple of days with no distractions. The first evening passed without incident. We lit a fire, opened a few beers, and sat around talking, laughing and catching up. Adam told some dumb jokes. Claire tried to teach us a card game none of us could figure out, and Nate got way too competitive about chopping firewood. It was one of those perfect, easy nights where everything feels right. But the next day, things started to shift. Subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. We decided to go for a hike, taking one of the trails that looped through the woods around the cabin. The forest was beautiful, dense with towering pines and patches of fog clinging to the ground. The silence was palpable, though almost too quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. As we walked, I started to notice things. Little things. The trees seemed wrong, not in any obvious way, but I kept catching glimpses of their branches twisting in strange directions, almost as if they were moving. But whenever I turned to look, they were still. I brushed it off as my imagination, or maybe the remnants of a hangover from the night before. We'd been walking for about an hour when we found it. A clearing, not too far from the trail. At first, I thought it was just a break in the trees, but as we stepped closer, I realized something was off. The grass in the clearing was dead, completely devoid of color, and the air smelled strange, like something had rotted there long ago, but there were no signs of animals or decay, just that unsettling smell. "What the hell is that?" Claire asked, her voice breaking the silence. Adam shrugged. "Maybe lightning struck here or something. It happens." Nate didn't say anything. He just stood there staring at the clearing like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. I could see the unease in his eyes, though. I felt it too. "Let's head back," I said, trying to sound casual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there. We turned around, heading back toward the cabin, but the mood had shifted. The light was dimmer now, the sun hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the quiet. It was different. It wasn't the peaceful silence we'd noticed before. It was heavy, oppressive, like the forest was watching us. No one spoke on the way back, not until we got to the cabin. That's when Nate finally said something. "Did it feel weird to you guys out there?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Claire laughed, but it was nervous. "You mean other than the creepy dead clearing?" "No, it wasn't just that," Nate continued. "I don't know. It just felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there." Adam waved him off, trying to lighten the mood. "You're just freaked out because we watched that horror movie last weekend. Come on, man, it's just a bunch of trees." But I knew Nate wasn't joking. I could feel it too. And when I lay in bed that night, staring at the dark wooden ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to the sound of knocking. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the shutters or something, but then I heard it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. It was coming from the front door. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, listening. The cabin was dead silent, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth. But then the knocks came again, louder this time. 3 sharp raps, like someone or something was trying to get in. I climbed out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor, and crept to the door. I don't know what I was expecting, but when I opened it, there was no one there. There was no one there. Just the dark woods, the wind rustling the trees, and the faint smell of smoke in the air. But the fire was out. I stood there for a minute, staring into the darkness before quietly shutting the door and locking it. I told myself it was just the wind, that I was being paranoid. But as I climbed back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, everyone was acting strange. Claire was quieter than usual, constantly glancing out the window as if expecting to see something. Nate looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept at all. Adam was trying to be upbeat, but I could tell he was uneasy too. No one mentioned the knocking, and I didn't bring it up. I wasn't sure if it had really happened, or if it was just a bad dream. But things only got worse from there. We spent most of the day inside the cabin, avoiding the woods. Adam suggested going for another hike, but no one seemed interested. I think we were all scared, though none of us wanted to admit it. The tension was suffocating, and by the time night fell, it was clear that something was seriously wrong. It started with the footsteps. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, more distinct. Slow, deliberate steps, circling the cabin. We all heard them, but no one said a word. We just sat there, listening, too terrified to move. At some point, Adam finally broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Nate nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Yeah." "Maybe it's just an animal," Claire whispered, though she didn't sound convinced. But we all knew it wasn't an animal. Animals don't walk like that. Animals don't knock on doors. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth outside the cabin, stopping every few minutes before starting up again. It felt like whoever, or whatever, was out there was waiting for something, watching us, toying with us. By midnight, the footsteps stopped, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then we heard the whispering. It started softly, barely a whisper at all, like the wind brushing against the windows. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it was clear that someone was whispering just outside the door. "Let us in," the voice said. "Let us in." I felt my blood turn to ice. The voice was low, raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. And it wasn't just one voice, it was many, all speaking in unison, overlapping, echoing through the cabin. "Let us in." We were frozen. No one moved, no one spoke. We just sat there, staring at the door, listening to the voices. They kept repeating the same phrase over and over, like a chant, like a demand. "Let us in." I don't know how long we sat there, but eventually the voices stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was thick, suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of the room. None of us dared to move, too afraid that the slightest sound would bring the voices back. When morning finally came, we packed our things in silence. No one said a word about what had happened. We didn't need to. We all knew something was out there, something that wasn't going to leave us alone. As we drove away from the cabin, I glanced back at the woods one last time. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something, someone, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us, but when I blinked, they were gone. It's been years since that weekend, but I still think about it all the time. I've tried to rationalize it, tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that we were all just freaked out by the isolation and the dark. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was in those woods. Something that wanted to get in, and I thank God every day that we didn't let it. But sometimes, late at night, I hear those footsteps again, slow, deliberate, circling my house. And then the whispering. "Let us in." I never open the door.